This is the story of one of World War II's most controversial battles, where 50,000 German soldiers surrendered to Canadian forces, while one of America's most aggressive generals sat under orders not to advance. The Falaise Pocket, fought between August 7th and 21st in 1944, gave the Allies a chance to trap and destroy the entire German 7th Army. But the battle didn't unfold the way most people think. For 8 decades now, historians have argued about who deserves credit, who deserves blame, and whether the Allies threw away their chance to end the war months earlier than they did. Popular narratives often center on General George Patton and his rapid advance across France, but the actual closing of the Falaise Gap came from Canadian and Polish forces, fighting desperate battles against some of Nazi Germany's most fanatical units, while Patton's Third Army was ordered to halt at Argentan. What follows is the verified history of what actually happened, drawn from primary sources, official military records, and the documentation that survived the war. The situation in Normandy, August 1944. Early August 1944 marked a turning point in the Normandy campaign. Allied forces had been fighting in France since D-Day on June 6th, and for 2 months, progress came measured in yards rather than miles. The hedgerow country of Normandy, what the French called the bocage, favored defenders, and German forces had fought with bitter determination for every field and village. The strategic situation was about to shift dramatically. Operation Cobra launched on July 25th, and by month's end, the Americans had punched through. Patton's newly activated Third Army poured through the gap, racing south before wheeling east, while British and Canadian forces continued grinding against German positions from the north and threatening the city of Falaise. German High Command faced a problem that Adolf Hitler refused to acknowledge. Instead of authorizing a retreat, Hitler ordered his forces to hold their positions and even counterattack westward toward Avranches in what was called Operation Lüttich. That counterattack, launched on August 7th, turned into a disaster that didn't break through American lines, but instead pushed German forces deeper into what was becoming an encirclement. 20 German divisions found themselves concentrated in a pocket around Falaise by mid-August, representing the remnants of the 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army. American forces pressed from the south and west, Canadian and British forces pushed from the north, and Polish forces attached to the Canadian First Army moved to close the gap from the northeast. A complete encirclement meant the Allies could capture or destroy the bulk of German forces in northern France. The stakes couldn't have been higher, which is exactly what made the controversy over command decisions at Falaise so bitter and so lasting. Complete encirclement and destruction of these German armies might have shortened the war by months, prevented the Battle of the Bulge, and saved countless lives on both sides. The command structure. Understanding what happened at Falaise requires knowing who commanded what forces and how the Allied command structure actually worked in August 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower held the position of Supreme Allied Commander, but operational control of ground forces still rested with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the 21st Army Group. Montgomery's command included 2 Army groups, the British Second Army under Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey, and the newly operational American Third Army under Lieutenant General George Patton, activated just days earlier on August 1st. Canadian First Army had become operational on July the 23rd under Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, and his army included not only Canadian divisions but also British, Polish, and eventually other Allied units. Lieutenant General Guy Simons, one of the most innovative tactical commanders in the Canadian Army, served as his second-in-command for the 2nd Canadian Corps. Peak strength for 1st Canadian Army during this period ran anywhere from 175,000 to 450,000 troops, depending on which Allied units were attached at any given time. This massive multinational force would bear the primary burden of closing the Falaise Gap from the north, and that burden proved heavier than anyone anticipated. Key Canadian units included the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, the 4th Canadian Armoured Division, and the 2nd Canadian Armoured Brigade. Fighting alongside them was the 1st Polish Armoured Division under Major General Stanisław Maciek, and these Polish soldiers carried particular motivation since their country had been occupied since September 1939, and they fought with the intensity of men who had no homeland to return to. Operation Totalize, the first push toward Falaise. August 7th brought two simultaneous events. The Germans launched their failed counterattack at Mortain, and Lieutenant General Simons launched Operation Totalize, the Canadian First Army's drive toward Falaise from the north. Simons brought innovation to the problem of breaking through German defenses. He planned a night assault, which was unusual for armored operations, and he addressed the vulnerability of infantry to German anti-tank weapons by creating improvised armored personnel carriers. These kangaroos, created by removing the main guns from ram and priest self-propelled artillery pieces, allowed infantry to ride, protected inside armored vehicles, and represented a tactical innovation that would influence armored warfare for decades. After midnight on August 8th, 800 Royal Air Force heavy bombers plastered German positions, and the ground assault followed. Canadian and Polish forces advanced using concentrated armor formations with infantry following in the kangaroos, maintaining radio silence to achieve surprise while artillery fired on a time schedule rather than on specific observed targets. Totalize achieved striking success initially, with Canadian forces advancing approximately 9 miles toward Falaise in the first phase, but then they slammed into fierce German resistance centered on the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The Hitlerjugend Division requires explanation because this was no regular Wehrmacht unit. Elite Waffen-SS soldiers composed largely of teenage fanatics from the Hitler Youth made up this division, many of them 17 or 18 years old, but indoctrinated in Nazi ideology since childhood, and led by experienced officers and NCOs who had survived the Eastern Front. These young soldiers fought with a combination of skill and fanaticism that made them extraordinarily dangerous opponents, who showed little inclination to surrender and held their positions with a determination that slowed the Canadian advance significantly. Operation Totalize had stalled by August 10th. Canadian forces had advanced but hadn't reached Falaise, and the operation cost them dearly, with historians estimating approximately 5,500 casualties across both Totalize and its follow-up operation, including 1,479 killed or died of wounds and 4,023 wounded. Critics would later say the Canadians moved too slowly, and Canadian official historian C.P. Stacey would be among those critics, noting delays and questioning certain tactical decisions. Defenders of Canadian performance, particularly historian Terry Kopp in his work Fields of Fire, have pointed to the exhaustion of troops who had been fighting since D-Day, the difficult terrain, and the quality of German opposition. The Bocage country didn't favor attackers, and the German defenders weren't ready to quit. The American advance and the HALT order. American forces under Patton raced north and east in a wide sweeping movement, while Canadian forces pushed from the north. Patton's 15th Corps, under Major General Wade Hyslop, reached a position to drive north toward the town of Argentan by August 8th, and Argentan sits about 20 miles south of Falaise. The opportunity for a complete encirclement seemed obvious to everyone looking at a map. American forces pushing north to Falaise and linking up with Canadian forces pushing south would trap the entire German 7th Army with no escape route. But that's not what happened. August 13th brought a controversial order from Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, telling Patton to halt at Argentan and not advance further north toward Falaise. Patton complied, though his frustration was evident in his diary and in conversations with subordinates, and this halt order would become one of the most controversial command decisions of the entire Normandy campaign. Bradley explained his reasoning in his memoirs years later. "I preferred a solid shoulder at Argentan to a broken neck at Falaise," he stated, concerned about several factors that weighed on his mind. Friendly fire posed a real risk if American forces pushed north while Canadian forces pushed south, since Allied forces might fire on each other in the confusion of battle. Bradley also noted that Falaise was a long-sought British objective, and for them, a matter of immense prestige. If Patton's patrols grabbed Falaise, it would be an arrogant slap in the face to the British forces. Boundary issues complicated matters as well. Montgomery had set inter-army boundaries, and Bradley's forces crossing north of the designated boundary would have created command confusion. Plus, Bradley worried about the strength of German forces that might counterattack an American salient pushing north. General Eisenhower supported Bradley's decision at the time. When he reviewed the battle later, Eisenhower stated that he thought the gap should have been closed sooner and that doing so might have won us a complete battle of annihilation. But this was a criticism of the pace of operations overall rather than a rejection of Bradley's specific halt order. Patton's reaction to the halt order matched expectations. He believed the decision was a mistake, one that historians would condemn, and he even ordered a stenographic record of his conversation with Bradley's Chief of Staff on August 13th to be included in Third Army's official history as evidence he wanted documentation of his disagreement with the decision. An alleged quote from Patton supposedly said to Bradley on August 13th has circulated in historical literature. "Let me go to Falaise and we'll drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk." This quote appears in various sources, but consistently shows up with qualifiers like allegedly or reportedly, and it lacks verification in primary sources like Patton's diary or official communications. Whether Patton actually said this or not, the quote captures the spirit of his frustration at being held back from what he saw as an opportunity for a decisive victory. The strategic reality came down to this. With Patton halted at Argentan, the responsibility for closing the Falaise Gap from the north fell entirely on Canadian and Polish forces, and the gap they needed to close stretched approximately 20 miles wide. Operation Tractable. The final push operation. Totalize having stalled short of Falaise, Lieutenant General Simons planned a follow-up operation called Tractable and launched it on August 14th, which would prove to be the decisive push that finally closed the gap. Another massive aerial bombardment opened Tractable as 800 Royal Air Force heavy bombers struck German positions, but the operation encountered immediate problems when some bombs fell, short and hit Canadian and Polish positions. Despite this tragic friendly fire incident, the ground assault proceeded anyway. Falaise itself fell to the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division on August 16th, a symbolically important achievement since Falaise had been an objective since the early days of the Normandy campaign, and its fall signaled that the encirclement was tightening around German forces. Capturing Falaise wasn't the same as closing the gap, though. German forces were now desperately trying to escape eastward through the narrowing corridor between Allied forces, and the German High Command had finally, belatedly, authorized a retreat. Thousands of soldiers and hundreds of vehicles streamed east, trying to escape before the trap closed completely. The small town of Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives became the critical position, located on the Dives River along one of the main escape routes. Canadian forces holding this position could block German forces attempting to flee, and this is where one of the most remarkable small unit actions of the entire Normandy campaign took place. Major David Currie of the South Alberta Regiment held Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives against desperate German attempts to break through between August 18th and 21st, and what his force accomplished there would earn him the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian in the entire Normandy campaign. Currie commanded a mixed force of tanks, infantry, and anti-tank guns drawn from the South Alberta Regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and other units. His force was relatively small, perhaps 300 men with 15 to 20 tanks and supporting weapons, and they positioned themselves directly across the escape route that thousands of German soldiers needed to use to avoid capture. 3 days of nearly constant attack followed. German forces, knowing that escape through this corridor represented their only chance to avoid capture or death, attacked repeatedly, with tanks, artillery, and thousands of desperate soldiers, but Currie's force held that position. Fighting was intense and often at close range. Currie personally directed the defense, moving between positions under fire, coordinating tanks and infantry, and maintaining the cohesion of his force despite casualties and near-continuous combat. German forces attempting to bypass his position found him adjusting his defenses. Frontal attacks got repelled, and when surrender opportunities arose, he arranged them while maintaining security. Polish forces linked up with Currie's position by the time the Falaise Pocket was effectively sealed, and by then his force had fought off multiple German attacks, destroyed numerous enemy vehicles, and taken hundreds of prisoners. The official citation for his Victoria Cross noted that his courage, coolness, and supreme disregard for personal safety during 3 days of fierce and almost continuous fighting were instrumental in closing the gap. The Army Victoria Cross ranks as the highest military decoration in the British Commonwealth, equivalent to the American Medal of Honor, and Major David Currie's award being the only one earned by a Canadian soldier during the entire Normandy campaign indicates the significance of the action at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive. 1st Polish Armored Division also played a crucial role in closing the gap as Polish forces advanced from the northeast and reached positions on August 19th that effectively sealed the pocket from that direction. The Poles fought with particular determination, since these were soldiers who had been in exile since 1939 and were not inclined to give German forces any quarter. Polish forces paid heavily for their role. Approximately 1,441 casualties, including 325 killed, 1,002 wounded, and 114 missing, represented roughly 20% of the division's combat strength and reflected the intensity of the fighting they endured. Allied forces from the north and south had linked up by August 21st, effectively sealing the Falaise Pocket and trapping tens of thousands of German soldiers inside. The aftermath proved catastrophic for German forces. Contemporary estimates suggest 10,000 to 15,000 German soldiers were killed in the pocket itself, and between 40,000 and 50,000 were captured. The bulk of these prisoners surrendered to Canadian forces, particularly the 4th Canadian Armored Division, a documented fact that has sometimes been obscured in popular histories focused on American actions. General Eisenhower visited the battlefield 48 hours after the gap closed, and his description provides insight into the intensity of what had occurred there. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, he wrote. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. Roads choked with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, and bodies created a scene of destruction that shocked even veterans of previous campaigns. The German 7th Army, once a formidable fighting force, had been shattered with divisions that had numbered thousands of men, reduced to hundreds, and equipment that had taken years to produce destroyed in days. But here's the source of the continuing controversy. Not all German forces were trapped. Somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 German soldiers managed to escape eastward before the gap closed completely, and these included experienced officers and soldiers who would reform units and fight again at Arnhem in the Siegfried Line and ultimately in the Battle of the Bulge that December. Historians have debated what happened at Falaise and whether the Allied command made the right decisions for 8 decades now, and the debate shows no signs of ending. The central question has always been whether the Allies could have closed the gap sooner and trapped more German forces. Patton, being allowed to push north from Argentan to Falaise, might have completed the encirclement days earlier. Fewer Germans might have escaped, and the war might have been shortened. But these questions have generated a substantial body of historical literature, with answers that depend on which historian you ask. Canadian Major General Richard Romer wrote a book in 1981 titled Falaise Gap, arguing that Montgomery had deliberately stopped Patton so that Canadian and British forces could get the credit for closing the gap. Romer defended Patton's position and placed blame on Montgomery for decision-making that allowed Germans to escape. Other historians have defended the command decisions, though. Bradley's concerns about friendly fire were legitimate, since in the confusion of a meeting engagement, American and Canadian forces very well might have fired on each other. Patton's forces, though aggressive, were not invincible and might have faced determined German resistance that could have held them short of Falaise anyway. Closing the gap was always going to take time, and blame for the escape of German forces should be shared among all the Allied commanders rather than placed on any one decision or commander. Canadian official historian C.P. Stacey criticized Canadian performance, suggesting that 2nd Canadian Division could have moved faster toward Falaise. British historian Chester Wilmot wrote that Montgomery failed to reinforce Symonds adequately during the critical phases of the battle. More recent Canadian scholarship has pushed back against these criticisms, though. Terry Kopp's Fields of Fire examines Canadian operations in Normandy and defends Canadian performance, noting the exhaustion of troops who had been in nearly continuous combat since D-Day, the difficult terrain, the quality of German opposition, and the innovative tactics that Symonds employed. Kopp argues that the criticism of Canadian forces has sometimes been unfair and has underestimated both the challenges they faced and the effectiveness of their operations. What's notable about this historiographical debate is what it focuses on: blame for failure rather than credit for success. The debate has centered on who should be blamed for allowing Germans to escape rather than on who deserves credit for the Germans who were captured or killed, which reveals something about how military history often gets remembered, since failures and controversies tend to dominate the narrative, while actual achievements sometimes get obscured. Primary sources, including official records, diaries, and after-action reports, tell us what actually happened at Falaise when we look at what they contain, rather than at what later narratives have claimed. Patton's diary and official communications show frustration at being halted. He believed he could have closed the gap if allowed to advance, made his views known to Bradley and to his staff, and believed history would vindicate his position, but Patton's documented statements don't show him claiming credit for Canadian operations. Instead, they show him arguing he should have been allowed to participate more fully in closing the gap, which is a significant distinction since the controversy in the sources is about who should have done what, rather than about who deserves credit for what was actually accomplished. Bradley's memoirs and contemporary communications show a commander concerned about friendly fire, about command boundaries, and about Allied sensitivities. His statement about Falaise being a long-sought British objective reveals his awareness that allowing American forces to capture it might have created political friction within the Allied command structure, and whether this was the right consideration to weigh against military effectiveness is debatable, but it was clearly a factor in his thinking. Eisenhower's statements show a commander who supported his subordinate's decision at the time, but later wished the gap had been closed more quickly, with his focus on the strategic opportunity that was partially missed, rather than on assigning credit or blame to specific commanders or national forces. Canadian official records document the operations, the casualties, and the achievements, showing forces that fought continuously for 2 weeks, advanced against determined opposition, captured Falaise, sealed the gap at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive, and took the bulk of German prisoners in the pocket. Polish records document a division that suffered 20% casualties in achieving its objectives, a casualty rate that indicates the intensity of combat and the determination with which they fought. What we don't find in these primary sources is a documented dispute about credit, disputes about strategy, about command decisions, about whether the right choices were made appear throughout the records, but we don't find Patton claiming he closed the Falaise Gap, or Eisenhower rebuking him for such a claim, or Canadian forces being denied credit for their role. This matters because military history often gets distorted by apocryphal stories that simplify complex events into dramatic narratives. The actual history of the Falaise Pocket is dramatic enough without needing embellishment, and the real story is one of difficult command decisions, hard fighting by multiple national forces, significant achievements, and persistent questions about whether more could have been accomplished. The real lessons of Falaise. Stepping back from the controversies and examining what the Battle of the Falaise Pocket actually demonstrates reveals several lessons worth considering. Closing an encirclement against a determined enemy is extraordinarily difficult, requiring coordination between multiple forces advancing from different directions, maintaining pressure while managing logistics and casualties, and dealing with an enemy who knows they're trapped and will fight desperately to escape. Allied forces at Falaise faced all these challenges, and while they didn't achieve a perfect encirclement, they did destroy or capture the majority of German forces in the pocket. Coalition warfare creates complications that don't exist in single-nation operations. Allied command at Falaise involved American, British, Canadian, and Polish forces, each with their own command structures, national interests, and sensitivities. And Bradley's concern about who captured Falaise and what that might mean for Allied relations wasn't just political sensitivity, but reflected the real challenge of maintaining coalition cohesion. Sometimes military decisions can't be made purely on tactical grounds. Tactical innovation matters in ways that extend beyond single battles. Simmons's use of Kangaroo armored personnel carriers and night assault tactics showed creative adaptation to tactical problems, and these innovations became standard practices in later operations, influencing armored warfare for decades. Unit cohesion and leadership at the tactical level can be decisive in unexpected ways. Major Currie's stand at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dive demonstrates how a relatively small force, well-led and properly positioned, can have strategic impact since the hundreds of men under his command held a position that was critical to closing the gap against thousands of enemy soldiers trying to break through. Historical memory is often incomplete and sometimes distorted. The Falaise Pocket has entered popular history primarily through narratives that focus on Patton and on controversy about command decisions, while the actual fighting done by Canadian and Polish forces is less well known in popular accounts, despite the fact that these forces bore the primary burden of closing the gap and took the majority of prisoners. Why this? History matters. Understanding what actually happened at Falaise matters for reasons beyond historical accuracy alone. It matters because it demonstrates the contributions of forces that are sometimes marginalized in popular accounts of World War II. Canadian forces fought throughout the Northwest Europe campaign from D-Day to VE Day and played crucial roles in numerous operations, but the popular narrative of the war often focuses heavily on American and British operations. While those forces certainly deserve recognition, a complete account requires acknowledging what other Allied forces accomplished. It matters because it shows the complexity of military operations and the difficulty of command decisions. The debate about Bradley's HALT order isn't just about whether he made the right choice, but about the challenges of coalition warfare, the tension between tactical opportunity and operational risk, and the impossibility of knowing with certainty what would have happened if different decisions had been made. It matters because it illustrates how historical controversies develop and persist over decades. The Falaise Pocket has been controversial for 80 years, precisely because reasonable people can disagree about whether different decisions would have produced better results. And this kind of debate is healthy in historical analysis when it's based on accurate understanding of what actually happened, rather than on simplified or distorted narratives. And it matters because the real history is more interesting than the simplified versions. The stand at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives is a remarkable story of tactical leadership and courage. The desperate fighting to close the gap involved innovation, determination, and sacrifice, and the strategic implications of trapping most, but not all, of the German 7th Army shaped the course of the campaign for months afterward. These stories deserve to be told accurately and completely. What can we say with certainty about what happened at Falaise based on the documentary evidence that survived? Allied forces conducted a successful encirclement operation between August 7th and 21st in 1944 that destroyed or captured the majority of German forces in the Falaise Pocket. Canadian First Army, under Lieutenant General Crerar, with operations directed by Lieutenant General Simons, conducted Operations Totalize and Tractable, which advanced from the north, captured Falaise, and sealed the gap. 4th Canadian Armored Division took the bulk of the approximately 50,000 German prisoners captured in the pocket. Major David Currie earned the Victoria Cross for his leadership during the critical stand at Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, the only Victoria Cross awarded to a Canadian in the Normandy campaign. 1st Polish Armored Division suffered approximately 20% casualties while fighting to close the gap from the northeast. Bradley halted Patton's advance at Argentan on August 13th, and Eisenhower supported this decision. Estimates suggest between 20,000 and 100,000 German soldiers escaped before the gap closed completely. The battlefield was devastating, with German forces suffering catastrophic losses in men and equipment. Historians have debated for 80 years whether different command decisions would have produced better results. The primary historical controversy has centered on blame for incomplete encirclement rather than on disputes about credit for the achievement. These are the facts supported by primary sources and verified by historical scholarship. They tell a story of hard fighting, difficult decisions, significant achievement, and continuing debate about what more might have been accomplished. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket gets remembered often as a controversial missed opportunity, a chance to trap and destroy the entire German 7th Army that was only partially realized, and there's truth to that. Characterization: the gap being closed days earlier, more German forces being trapped, the strategic situation being different, all remain real possibilities that didn't happen. Focusing only on what didn't happen can obscure what did happen, though. Canadian and Polish forces fought for 2 weeks to close a gap that Patton's forces were ordered not to advance toward, faced elite German units, including the fanatical 12th SS Panzer Division, and prevailed. They captured Falaise, held Saint-Lambert-sur-Dives, sealed the gap, and when it was over, 50,000 German soldiers had surrendered mostly to Canadian forces, while the German 7th Army had been shattered as an effective fighting force. This wasn't a failure, but a significant Allied victory achieved at considerable cost against determined opposition. The victory wasn't complete since some German forces escaped, but that simply reflects the reality that war is complicated, that encirclement operations are difficult, and that competent enemies don't cooperate with plans to destroy them. The continuing debate about the command decisions at Falaise represents legitimate historical analysis, asking whether Bradley should have allowed Patton to advance, whether Simons moved quickly enough, whether Montgomery provided adequate support, are all reasonable questions that historians will likely continue debating for decades to come. That debate should be based on what actually happened, though, not on simplified narratives or apocryphal stories. The historical record shows inter-Allied tensions, strategic disagreements, and differing opinions about how operations should have been conducted, but it doesn't show Patton claiming credit for Canadian victories or Eisenhower rebuking anyone for such claims. The actual controversies were about command decisions and their consequences rather than about who deserved credit for documented achievements. Understanding this distinction matters because military history serves multiple purposes. It honors those who served and sacrificed, provides lessons for future commanders and strategists, helps us understand how major historical events unfolded and why they mattered, and contributes to our collective memory of conflicts that shaped the world we live in. The Canadians who fought at Falaise, the Poles who closed the gap despite 20% casualties, individual soldiers like Major David Currie, who showed extraordinary leadership in critical moments, are the people who actually accomplished what needed to be done. Their achievements deserve recognition based on the historical record rather than on mythologized narratives that obscure what really happened. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket was a complex operation involving multiple national forces, difficult command decisions, hard fighting, and partial success. It was controversial then and remains controversial now. But controversy about what more might have been accomplished shouldn't overshadow what was accomplished by Canadian, Polish, British, and American forces working together to destroy the German 7th Army and open the road to the liberation of France. That's the verified history, what the sources actually show, the story that deserves to be remembered accurately without embellishment, but also without diminishment. A story of Allied forces achieving a significant victory through courage, innovation, and sacrifice in some of the fiercest fighting of the entire Normandy campaign.